Hi there. If you're here, please do maybe give me a like or if you have the chat feature, feel free to let me know someone's there. I'm a couple minutes early, so we'll be patient. Hi. Hi, Erica. Well, welcome. Thanks for your help, Erica. I think we'll give him a couple minutes. How are you, Mindy? Oh, so you guys are ASU fans, huh? One of the kids I first worked with, he spent a little time as a wrestling coach down there at ASU. So he's down there now, just working, and that's why I was excited to see somebody from Tempe. I'm Husky, University of Washington. There you go. Yeah, they're hoping to finish up strong here. ASU's in the running too for the conference championship, right? Well, I'm pretty funny here by myself too, messing this YouTube channel up. So um, let's give them. We're going to start at 3:05. The great thing about the YouTube channel is it's going to record it. So if people are late or don't make it or got confused in all my instructions, then they can just watch it at a later time. But we'll give them 3 minutes. Were you able to get the PowerPoint open okay? Hey, we're up to 3 people now. Somebody else made it. Okay, good. Hi, Heather. Okay. So don't feel obligated. my hope is the YouTube records this so you can just watch it on your own at a later time that works better for you. So don't feel like you gotta force it. Okay, great. It sounded like you were recruiting them. I was excited to hear you have some behaviorists. That's my background in all of this too. Well, I started out as a teacher, but I like behavior. I wasn't so good at all the lesson planning. Okay, we're up to five, so we're getting people finding their way. I'm sorry for the trouble. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes and then we'll jump in. I know there's a group from Tempe here, and then there was maybe even a yes, it should be recording. So it should be available, and I'll send out a link to you after everybody after as well. That was the goal of trying YouTube, was that it would record it. Okay, we'll wait one more minute and then we'll get started. I'm glad ASU is well represented. There was also a group from Australia that was real interested, so that was exciting. Um, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so hopefully everybody has a copy of the PowerPoint. I'm going to kind of look at it on my screen as I talk and try to balance that with managing the chat box. I didn't put in a lot of questions, but I might stop at a couple points. There's a couple graphics I'd love your thoughts on as fellow behavior experts working to figure out how we can improve behavior supports for kids. Okay, so I'm going to start. At, I want to write down the time so I can tell people how long to wait to jump in. Okay. So real quick, thanks for coming. I was excited to hear this. I wasn't surprised. There was a lot of interest in the topic of defiance. Um, my over the course of my doctoral research centered a lot around PBIS. I spent a number of started my career as a teacher for kids with emotional disturbance. Then began writing behavior plans for a number of years for San Jose Unified, and then for a large district in the Sacramento area of 65,000 kids, helping them with their PBIS implementation. And that was the focus, the theme of my research. And it's been my passion. I love tough kids. Um, and so a lot of that was because I was one. What I learned, a couple things. I chose this topic because a lot of times maybe we try to do too much. Nationally every year, 2/3 of office discipline referrals are for the three Ds: defiance, disruption, and disrespect. And I always felt like in my work, the great challenge is I always felt like if we could make teachers as experts at responding and preventing those behaviors, then we've gone a long ways to addressing the behavior in our schools. Um, the other thing I want to really point out today, I'm going to try to be very practical. The lessons I learned writing behavior plans was the biggest challenge is implementation. Okay, we can, as a behavior analyst, we can spend a lot of time and we can write great 15-page behavior plans, but for the most part, teachers don't do them, and that's a consistent theme in the research. And so the focus of my doctoral research was finding behavior supports teachers can use. And the secret is they need to be low intensity in terms of labor intensity, and they need to be durable. So across settings, across situations. So that's kind of, I'm going to share a couple of those evidence-based practices that came about through that research and that have been effective in helping teachers change their practices. Um, so that's that. First thing I want to start out is this second slide. This was from a article I wrote from Mindset Works. Um, but it's based in the PBIS research and the basis of PBIS really. So the basis of PBIS is we're teaching behavior supports behavior just like we teach academics. Okay, and so along the left side, so the typical error we make in behavior is we attribute it to things within the child, such as ADHD, oppositional defiance, autism, what have you, as opposed to a behavior perspective is behavior is learned. Okay, I tell teachers we don't teach comma placement by telling kids where not to put commas, but that's what we do with behavior. We try to teach behavior by telling them what not to do. So this graphic is meant to highlight those different mindsets that teachers maybe bring when they're trying to figure out why is the child acting this way. um, the first thing you see are vastly different assumptions, and that's what really drives then how they respond. um, you see when teachers assume the child has learned it and that the problem behavior is very deliberate, then their consequences tend to center around punishment and increasing that, as opposed to if we can get teachers to see I need to teach this child the socially appropriate way to get his need met, just like I need to teach the child the socially appropriate way to cross multiply fractions. Now, teachers can start using their skills as educators to come up with ways to teach that skill, as opposed to how do we try to stop the problem. Does it? So, um, real quick, are there any thoughts when you look at this? What stands out to you guys as being important things we need to try to help teachers understand or that they are missing? If one or two comments, I'd love to hear them. Okay. Well, big idea is simply, I put this in terms of fixed and growth mindset due to the popularity, and those are familiar terms for teachers. I try to tell people um, I try to tell people it's an instructional approach to problem behavior. We are identifying the learning error, and then we are coming up with that socially appropriate replacement behavior, and then we're just figuring out the best ways to teach that socially appropriate skill. Just the same as, we teach paragraph indentation or comma placement or how to multiply. I see a question here. How do we change teacher perception? Um, yeah, that's the challenge. And I always feel like if we can get them to adopt this mindset, then we can have some success with behavior intervention. And until we get them to adopt this mindset, I think, at least in my experience, we always struggle. I would say couple things. We have to really be proactive. When we take, a common issue is a teacher starts having some difficulties with the student maybe a month or two into the year or a week in the year. And they try everything and they're on their own. And then finally by February, it gets to the level of the behaviorist. And oftentimes by that point, the teacher feels like they've tried everything and their mind is made up and the kid needs a new placement. So the more responsive we can be in preventing that and getting that message out. And I think it's a challenge in terms of just, teachers and what they are inundated within messages. They are inundated with ideas of ADHD and oppositional defiance and these things. And we have to get them to see that yes, that might predispose a child to certain behaviors, just like some kids are better at math by predisposition. But that doesn't mean behavior is still learned and we can still teach. The other part for me is helping the big shift. I assume my behaviorists are familiar with the dead person's rule. So I always try to get teachers to say, if a dead person can do it, it's not a behavior. So that means, typically teachers are, how do I get the kid to not interrupt? How do I get the kid to not be angry? How do I get the kid to not get in fights? As opposed to, what should the child do instead? What's the socially appropriate way to get that need met? And really try to press them to figure out what's the socially appropriate way. I tell them, we all have a right to get angry. It's the expression of that anger that gets kids in trouble. So really trying to help them see, one, what do they want the child to do instead, and then just the idea that behavior is learned. So hopefully that helps. If you want to ask more, Mindy, or if you have some great thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Because by no means is this is, to me, the meat of the conversation. As long as teachers still feel like this kid is refuses to cooperate, they are going to be reluctant to implement behavior interventions. And so until we can get them to see the picture, then we're going to struggle. Okay, so feel free to write more if you want. Um, I would say I'll touch on it here and we'll talk more in a bit. But the biggest error we make then, even when we get them to adopt this idea, is the critical thing, and it's the biggest gap in our behavior interventions. You don't change habitual behavior by saying, why don't you just raise your hand instead of yelling out? So the critical thing, I tell teachers, how do you become a good reader? And the answer is practice. How do you become good at math? The answer is practice. How do you become good at respect? The answer is practice. So we have to figure out ways to get loads of verbal and physical rehearsal into our interventions if we're going to change behavior. Okay? And that's a big step as we try to take our plan from paper to the classroom. We have to figure out, how are the student and teacher going to practice this? And the more practice they get, then their success goes up. But you're not going to change, especially with some of the kids you write behavior plans for. Some of that behaviors help them survive in their home life, and they're not going to give up those behaviors easily. So we have to really practice, and I'll give some further ideas about that as we go along. Okay. Next thing is just this is a brief warning. I think you guys as an audience will get it. But I think a lot of times the error is, we'll have kids 3 grade levels behind, and the teachers feel like the fact that he's not doing his grade level work is a defiance issue. Okay, so we have to have reasonable goals. Similarly, if a kid is running out of the class 10 times a day, to shift that to 0 is not a reasonable expectation. So we have to make sure our goals and our expectations in our interventions are reasonable. Otherwise, it often comes across as defiance when we're asking the child to do something they can't do. Okay. Um, the next thing I think I wanted to touch on is just this idea. This is why everybody wants to hear about defiance. This is why problem behavior is such an issue in schools now. With the range of challenges our students, or many students, are facing on a daily basis, ooh, I would, well, so the question is, what is a reasonable amount of goals on a behavior plan? Would depend on the intensity. I would definitely, I would be very reluctant to go over 3. That's for certain, especially if they're intense behaviors. Um, again, the biggest challenge in behavior supports is implementation. So the more different goals you're trying to get a busy classroom teacher to implement, you should expect that to even go down with each additional goal. Um, so that, yes. So feel free to ask more. I'm going to keep going, and when questions pop up, I'll pause. And I assume some of you guys in your districts, you see some of these issues, because I'm sure you see a lot of times these problems such as poverty and traumatic experiences and being behind academically, those interact. And I think, that's kind of the basis of PBIS, is we can no longer assume kids are coming to school ready and eager to learn. And that's why we have to start building up the toolbox of our teachers, because it's not one or two kids. Okay, it's 5 or 10. There's some research say, in a high poverty school, a third of the students will have academic or behavioral issues. So it's a whole class they're dealing with. Just some kids are standing out more than others. So the comment was working with teachers to some of their resistance about how students should know how to act and behave instead of intentional teaching and reinforcement. Yeah, I would imagine the other people in the audience agree. I and that's why I have invested a lot, and I can try to share with you some of the research to develop slides like this so they can see. The teachers want to say it's just that one kid. If you got rid of Billy, I would be fine. But that's just not the case. There are ranges, and somebody's got to be the worst kid in the class. And if one kid leaves, somebody else is going to replace that. So, yeah, I would invest a lot in, if you're trying to help teachers get the message of why this is important. And this also helps teachers, they embrace this because they struggle with this and they're frustrated with it. Um, and so this, being able to speak to some of the things kids are bringing with them can make the case for you in some of that regard. Um, so you can see what I did here. I just took some information from Time and some of the ACEs study, um, and then just some statewide benchmark data to get that sense. And then, yeah, you can just challenge them. Maybe don't tell them, ask them. One question I gave to a training last spring was, asking them, in what ways do these factors impact your ability to teach? And getting them to elaborate on some of the things. How do these factors impact student behavior? And letting them explain it. That's always a great way, rather than telling them, is maybe to ask some good question. How do kids from trauma tend to act in your class? And so that can be an strategy as well. Okay, feel free to ask more. We're going to move along. So the first thing I wanted to share in terms of interventions, this is based in some research around effective commands. And that's kind of an ugly word to teachers, so I try to put instructions. But the basic idea is proximity, eye contact, and praise can improve compliance by as much as 30–40%. So the idea, what I always see, the question is, do you think 40% of teens have always experienced mental illness, or is this an increasing rate? I want to be careful with that and respect that. I think we have changed some of the definitions of some of these words, such as mental illness, ADHD, trauma, what have you. So I think kids have always brought challenges. And so I try to, that's where I would leave it. What I use that information for is to make the case of why behavior is important. In terms of 40% of teens, I do think I, I would say the pervasiveness and the intensity of some of the problems have increased. I think for me personally, I think as the rate of poverty goes up, all these other things are going to continue to go up. When I do a little more exhaustive slide presentation on this, over the past 10 years, the rate of poverty in California has gone up by 7%. So that's going up pretty quickly, and that's going to impact a lot of these things. So that's kind of a philosophical question. Some people would say we're better at identifying it now. Some people might say we have lowered the definition. I don't know. Do you have an opinion, Brenda? It's a sensitive topic. So I would just use it to make the case for your behavior. This is what the experts are saying, and we don't need to argue with what the experts are saying, and we can just use it to build. So again, back to the idea of proximity, eye contact, and praise. So a typical scenario is math class. A lot of times teachers avoid kids that are difficult. You know, we all avoid people that we don't get along with. So what happens is maybe a lot of times they put their toughest kids in the back of the room. And when that kid starts misbehaving, the teacher sits behind her desk at the other side of the room and says, Dustin, quit talking during math. And that you can see that's a very weak command clear across the classroom, as opposed to an effective strategy would be for the teacher to be, active supervision walking the room. And when Dustin starts to misbehave, walks over to his desk and says, Dustin, can I have your attention, please? So then I'm waiting for eye contact. Okay. Once the student is looking at me, I say, Dustin, if you want to talk to your neighbor, what should you do? And then I say, thank you for looking at me and thank you for being on task. So just closing that proximity and then getting teachers, you can even do less as teachers get good with it. If I'm walking the room, I can just use a little tap on their desk. Oftentimes, I find just standing next to the kid makes them aware of their misbehavior and they adjust. So if you can really encourage your teachers to get practice some of that proximity, eye contact, and praise. So if I'm going to deliver a command to my difficult student that I expect resistance to, I am going to want to really close that gap between us and get in his zone. Not confrontationally, but I want him, not be talking to him across the room. And then ask for eye contact and then acknowledge the praise. And for me, eye contact is huge. For me, I tell people I fight my compliance battles over eye contact. I want to fight my compliance battles at the lowest levels possible. So if I'm working with a tough kid and I want to tell them, stop kicking people, I say, Dustin, can you look at me? And if when I say that, Dustin does this and crawls under the desk and everything else, what are the odds he's going to follow my command? He won't even acknowledge me. So that eye contact is my first level of the student acknowledging me as the authority figure. It's the first act of compliance. I learned, I was lucky. My dad was a world-class salesman. And so a lot of sales is just how do I get people to do things they don't want to do. None offhand, but I can dig around a little and see. I tend to, if you want some of the greatest, simplest ones, Chris Borgmeyer at Portland State University, Borgmeier. He has some pretty great online modules that are meant to train teachers in behavior plans and understanding behavior. And they're meant to be 1 or 2 page behavior plans. He was one of my professors and my doctoral advisors. He's probably one of the PBI's leaders in that nationally in terms of writing those actual behavior plans. Um, So you may want to look into him, but I can see what I can track down. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let me type his name real quick, and maybe I'll try to send a link in the follow-up. And this is maybe just a draft at spelling his name. So Portland State University. He has a pretty great website with free online modules and things. Great wealth of resources that you can really use. Has some great behavior plans, easy behavior plans, check-in, check-out programs, pre-corrections, prompting, meant to be very, very consumable. So, okay, it sounds like sample behavior plans. I'll work on that and maybe try to see what I can find in after we're done today. Okay. And I think what you're seeing here is these are meant more to be instructional strategies that teachers do that's going to impact how they act. Again, I want to get the child in the habit of acknowledging me as the authority figure. Them saying, I always marvel not being a parent. Well, my nephew's very spoiled. He's the only child of two lawyers. And it's amazing. He he's now in first grade. He's kind of lived his whole life other than around me, just telling adults what he wants. Instead of saying, "Can I have some more pizza?" It's "Give me more pizza." So in our world today, kids are very used to telling adults what to do. And that can be problematic in a classroom. Okay? So that's another thing that we can try to work on. And if we can build skills around them acknowledging the adults and asking, it tends to make a lot of difference. So I'm going to move now. I think I'm on the one that says teach compliance. Um, Here again, I want to invest in teaching and rewarding that rule following behavior. A big thing I tell teachers, this would be kind of two rules. One, this would be teaching that, focusing on what I want and how do I teach that, reinforce that. Um, an idea that tends to resonate well with teachers is telling them, your attention is the currency of the classroom. So you're just by what you focus on, you decide what gets paid. And so if our teachers are spending a lot of time and energy in defiance, then that's what our attention starved kids are going to do so they can get attention. Okay. Um, Rule following games. Simon Says, red light, green light. Those are all great self control games, compliance games that can be taught and practiced. Again, so I wanted to go on the middle one there is really maximizing the rehearsal and practice of compliance. So the example I always think of was this little kindergarten kid, and he would get in a fight every day at recess, pretty much. And somehow, I think one of the kids he would fight, his neighbor was the superintendent or something. So with every fight, the superintendent of the San Jose Unified heard about it. So it was very intense. And so really had to just every day, 10, when I see the kid, probably 20 times a day, what are you going to do at recess if you get upset? And if he says, I'll do whatever I want, then I know he's not ready to go to recess. Does that make sense? So that's my first check in. I tell teachers, if he can't tell you the appropriate thing to do when he's happy, he's certainly not going to do it when he's mad. Okay? So finding ways to build in that verbal and physical rehearsal is going to make a huge difference when that setting arrives. Because the other thing it does, and it leads me into the idea of prompting and pre-correction, is if all day long we've talked about what are you going to do when you get mad at recess, if I'm watching him at recess and I start to see him become elevated, I can go over and just prompt him. Dustin, what should you do if you're upset? Dustin, what did we talk about this morning? So now, because I've already built it in, now my prompts are going to take a lot better hold. And so that's kind of here. Then this is the idea of pre-correction. Um, it's a widely researched idea in PBIS, and it's a neat, simple idea. It's prompting, it's advertising. Um, we want to shift from correcting students after behavior has occurred. Teachers can be great at that. It also can be called nagging. To being proactive. We can't predict when some students are going to cause problems. So what we want to teach teachers to do is as they approach those problem areas, so when we're walking in from recess to get ready for math, I remind Dustin, what should you do if you get stuck on a math problem? And so we are prompting them. And what that does two big things. One, it really takes a lot of the strain off of the student teacher relationship. Okay, so now it's not so much correcting, why did you do that, what's going on. um, but the bigger thing in behavior interventions, we always talk about, well, you need to praise the kid more, trying to get teachers to increase their praise. But a lot of times there isn't much to praise. So what prompting can do is now it gives me something I can praise the kid for. We talked about raising your hand during math class, and now you did it. Okay, so it gives those teachers something they have asked the child to do that the child can do. Um, the other part, pretty much all consequence-based strategies in the research are problematic. Okay, even if they work, they're taking away instructional time. They're taking away, kind of wearing on the student-teacher relationship. So it tends to be all reactive strategies tend to be problematic. So we want to teach. I always tell teachers, I always want to be on the offense. I don't want to be reacting to what the child has done. I want to be shaping that environment, helping them, reminding them of their strategies as we enter that environment. So I am steering them where I want them to go. And so that's why pre-correction can be a real tool. Here's something, a pre-correction plan. Chris Borgmeyer has some other examples, but this is what we did in my research, and this is the format from the original pre-correction research. And I would almost look at this as sort of a template of a simple BSP, a one-page BSP that we want teachers to be able to, at the lowest levels, quickly make some changes. So they're identifying the problem area, what the kid should do instead, then they're looking at how they can set the kid up to succeed, practicing it and reinforcing it. What I found in my research when I trained teachers in this, one of the probably the biggest thing teachers got out of it was teachers that struggle with problem behavior tend to not have clear expectations, procedures, and rules. So in order to pre-correct a student, they had to clearly identify what are their expectations in that scenario. So in your classes where there aren't clear instructions of expectations for what the students should do during direct instruction time, this process helps them clarify what are their expectations at that time. You know, typically you talk to them, they'll say, well, God, I wish they'd stop talking out. And this kid gets up to sharpen his pencil, and these kids are crawling on the floor, but they're never getting to that. Well, what are your expectations during that time? So this sort of simple process can walk them through identifying those expectations so they can then start prompting some of that as opposed to saying no, stop, don't all day. Okay? So pre-correction is a great research-based strategy. The other one, I'm sure my behaviorists love if-then statements, contingent access. And, you know, again, I tell people defiant kids are easy. Whatever you tell them not to do, they're going to do. Um, so the idea here is I don't want to ever get in a situation where I'm telling the child, well, I want to really limit the situations where I'm telling the child, no, do not do that. One, if a child's heard 20 times a day, don't do that, it kind of wears out. I want them to know when I say stop, I mean stop. And if I, so I want to really limit that. And the other part is with oppositional kids, you, whatever you tell them not to do is you're steering them to how they can frustrate and anger the teacher. Um, a big thing to try to help teachers understand with some of this is telling them, helping them see, I am trying to help the child get a need met. I am trying to create access. This is not, so an error, teachers making if-then statements, they'd say, if you don't get your work done, then you can't go to recess. Or, you know, at home, you know, if you're going to keep playing that game, I'm going to ground you for a week. As opposed to, I want to help the child get to recess. I want to help the child play the game. I'm trying to give them what they want. I'm telling them how to get it. If you want to go to recess, then you need to complete your math work. I would love to help you complete it. Anything I can do to help get you to recess, I'm here to do. And then I try to just be a broken record. The kid will say, what about this? What about that? We can talk about that, all that after your math work's done. But they're, you know, kids are great at questioning. One great rule you can use with teachers too is the person asking the question, in a general sense, in behavior theory, social psychology, the person asking questions is generally controlling the conversation. So I know if I'm working with difficult kids and I find myself answering a lot of questions, I know I need to to flip that and say, we can talk about that after. Okay, I don't say no or anything like that. We can talk about that once your work is done. Once they have done what I said, we can talk about whatever you like. So that can be a little tool to keep in mind. But yeah, if then statements, if you can really train your teachers in that, it helps a lot in how to frame the conversation. Um, I'm going to wrap up here because my goal was 40 minutes. So this is kind of my summary here. Let me take a closer look. Again, we have to make sure we have those reasonable expectations. And then here, the other part of our foundation is sort of that growth mindset about behavior. Getting them to see behavior is learned, and I can teach behavior just like I teach math, science, social studies, anything else. And helping them switch from what they don't want the kid to do to what they want to see more of. I try to tell people, really, I want to empower the child. I'm helping them get a need met. I don't judge where a child's needs come from. That's where, back to our original question, teachers, a lot of times they'll get talking, well, this kid's mom and this kid's dad, and he comes from the wrong side of the tracks and all that. What I like about behavior is we teach behavior. I'm not so concerned about who his mom is, who his brother is. I am concerned with how can I help the child get a need met in a socially appropriate way. Then we really try to get those kids in the habit of building that compliance, teaching it directly. Well, last thing, I was thinking over the summer, doing a training for staff at a residential facility for foster kids, level 14 kids, so the toughest kids in the state of California. The idea being, let's say we want to, we want to teach compliance. We want to improve compliance in our students. Which is a better scenario place to teach compliance, during math class or during basketball? Okay. So the idea being, when we're doing those preferred activities, that's when we can be pretty particular about our expectations, waiting, taking turns, asking questions, what have you, as opposed to during math when they don't want to do it to begin with. Okay. So we can build that relationship. We can build the student teacher follow direction relationship during those preferred activities. Simon says, red light, green light, recess. Those are chances where we can build compliance. We build our rule following there, not during math. Okay. And those are my last thoughts. I think, oh, there was a question. One of the requests was to talk some about student motivation. So the last slide you look at there, the engagement equation, I've written a lot about this with Houghton Mifflin and just wrote an article for the Association of California School Administrators about this. For the most part, intrinsic motivation is based around those four questions. Those are your fundamental aspects of, if we want kids to do hard things that they are not good at, they need to feel like they belong. They need to understand why doing that difficult task is important to them. And they need to feel like if they work hard, they will get better at it. Okay? The idea being, why would I work hard at something I don't like if it's not important? Why would I work hard at something if my hard work doesn't matter? Why would I work hard if these people don't like me, whether I do it or not? Okay. So when you're thinking of intrinsic motivation, these are the basic questions. They're widely researched. Mindset Scholars Network has done a lot of research around this. The idea of belonging, I always put it belonging, autonomy, and meaning. So BAM. So when you want to think of intrinsic motivation, think of BAM. How do we help kids have a sense of belonging, a sense of autonomy or control, and then a sense of meaning about the task at hand? And if we can do that, then that's when we trigger that fire and desire to learn. So that's what I have. If you'd like to type a couple questions or request some ideas or research you'd like me to share, then I would be glad to jot those down and work on that in a follow-up email. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry for the trouble. This was my first YouTube. I was always a Zoom guy. But the hope is, if this was helpful, it should be recorded and there should be a link you can share with other team members if you like. Middle school scenarios and examples of defiance. Um, so obviously you're going to have defiance around academic tasks, avoiding academic tasks. And then, so in terms of, now you put me on the spot. So, what I would go back to when I look at scenarios is I would come back to that idea of the pre-correction plan. It's funny, I keep flipping back to slides, forgetting you guys can't see them. And I would help them identify the context. Certainly, any unpopular task, math is going to be a scenario. So help the teachers walk through during math class, whole class instruction. What do students do? Okay, what is your expectation? So the most common example, pretty much, I tell people as a teacher, I am eager to help kids that are respectful. Okay, my job, I want to help kids. Teachers get defensive over how things are presented, the behavior. So a scenario would be middle school math during whole class instruction, kids are interrupting, talking to their neighbors. The error teachers make, and that's a great one. The error teachers make is they want to say, don't talk out during whole class instruction. And that's obviously that's the dead person's rule, right? Dead person cannot talk during whole class instruction. As opposed to, if you want to talk during whole class instruction, what should you do? And then that teacher, typically 75% of the stuff is raise your hand and ask. The other error you'll see in struggling teachers is teachers will respond to call outs. So if my rule in my class is don't talk during whole class instruction and a kid talks and the teacher responds, now the kid is seeing my rules are negotiable. There are exceptions. And now they're going to have to find those. So, and nobody's perfect in that, but we need to catch ourselves when we're breaking our own rules and calling on kids when we said they need to raise their hand. And then kids get to feeling like things are unfair and what have you. So that's a common one. The transitions, hallway activities, being on time to class. So the idea there is you go back to your PBIS idea and your instructional approach. Do we have a clear expectation of hallway procedures during transition? Have we taught those expectations to mastery? So our 80%, so then we start to get in our pyramid. Are 80% of the kids executing those expectations? If not, then we need to go back, reteach, and additional practice. Okay? If it's a group, then we need to go back, reteach, and additional practice. So for me, I always tell teachers, what's your first intervention if a kid's struggling to learn his timetables? It's reteach and additional practice. And it's the same idea in behavior supports. The first thing we need to do when we're identifying an error pattern is go back and reteach with additional practice that expectation. Then so that would probably be your number one tier 2 intervention, would be reteaching and additional practice. Then I would layer in additional things beyond that. Mindy, I would say if you have some scenarios you want to talk through, feel free to email me, and maybe that's a better way to go about that, since we can have some dialogue, or we could have a phone conversation where I could hear your thoughts. So maybe that's something. Feel free to follow up about that, and let's pursue it that way. I'm glad to help, and we'll go from there. Is it all right? Sounds good. Yeah, feel free. I love talking behavior. We can talk define again. If we can make teachers masters at defiance, disrespect, and disruption, then we've tackled 2/3 of the problem behavior. Okay, and a lot of it will not escalate if we can be effective at that. Is there anything else? Okay, thank you, people. I'll follow up a little in an email and explore some resources that I can share. And if you have additional questions, please reach out. I apologize for some of the confusion with YouTube. It was a learning experience for me as well. So I'll wait about another minute, then I'll close out. Okay, great. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Erica. I appreciate your guys' attention. Feel free, I'll send a link, share it with who you like. Take care. Ugh.